What is going on, everybody? I have a new acquaintance that wanted me to go ahead and break down an analysis on a game of his choice. It was one of the more difficult games that he played. I think it's his highest rating competitor, actually. But he's black here, and he played the Caro-Kann, which is my specialty. I've been playing the Caro-Kann for well over a decade now, and I have several hours of tutorials on that opening alone. So let's break down his game and let's see where we can get him to improve. I put this neat little chart together for him. You can pause it and go over it in a little more detail later if you want. But the primary thing I'm pulling out of it is it was a pretty even game until the end. He probably had a winning lead that he could have converted on, but obviously something happened, and then the enemy took it away. Last thing we're going to cover before we actually jump into the gameplay. You didn't have as many best moves as him, but you had 12 errors of ranging severity, and he only had 11. So you got that. You definitely used your bishops better. You had 88 accuracy. He only had 68, but we see that your rook and king definitely have some work to cut out for them. But you managed your time well, a lot better than him. And the computer predicted that you were only going to get like 22%. And you ended up, busting out 70. So you got that going. But let's get into the gameplay now. I only looked at the first three moves, so E4, C6, and D4, and I have no idea if this is exchange, advanced, classical, no clue. Time to find out. Drum roll, please. We got an advanced on our hands. Most games are, honestly. And you played C5. You should not be playing C5 as your main opening. I went through your games. You have 31 games where you play C5 and nothing else. There's a reason why everyone as a master or above plays bishop F5 80% of the time. They use C5 only as an oddball attack, like if they play someone multiple games in a row and they want to throw something different out at them. It's way more risky. It instantly opens up the light squared diagonal for your king. Obviously, white can't have a good attack on you right away because you can defend properly, but it puts a chink in your armor that they can start to peel apart. You don't want to give any of that in the opening. If you're not going to take my advice and play bishop f5 and you're going to continue to play c5, play the French. You'll save yourself a whole tempo. Instead of using c6 to support your d5 pawn, use the e6 pawn. After the advanced variation, you don't have to sit here and move the pawn once and then twice again. You bring it right up to c5. So that saves you a full tempo. After they capture, look at the position. Here they move their queen to d4. If you're going to continue to play c5, play the French because the move order is slightly different, but you move the same pieces in the exact same position with a turn less. So we got to rewind and go to the position where we wasted a turn, and the queen comes out to d4. This is already going against opening principles, and they're moving their queen before their bishops and knights are developed. You can punish that. The only time you move your queen out early is if it's a necessary recapture, like you're playing the Scandinavian. You moved your queen out for a check. That was a mistake. You had a better option of punishing them moving their queen. Anytime a queen moves early, you want to hit it and attack it as much as you can and make them lose the tempo and develop. You could have brought your knight right to c6. That's a developing move, and they're going to waste a tempo because they got to move their queen again now. If they don't want to move their queen, they have one line, which is all forced. They got bishop to b5, pinning your knight, but you have queen to a5 check, which hits the king. They only have one move. It's forced. Knight to c3. It blocks the check and vitally protects the bishop, but it does not matter. You can capture the bishop with the queen. The slick move forces them to recapture with the knight, but then you can capture their queen with your knight. They'll capture your knight with theirs, and then you can finally pick up the c-pawn. If we want something with a little more spunk and pizzazz, go ahead and back that up, and we can bring the knight right to d7 instead of c6. And you got to ignore the analysis. It's wrong. This is 0.00 on the Stockfish analysis. And white has a couple tries. It can play b4. In that case, knight e7 works beautifully, looking to jump again and hit the queen. It can try pinning the knight, and that's bishop to b5. And in that case, you just push a6. And last but not least, if they push knight to f3, you want to go ahead and capture the pawn on c5 and hit the queen. Queen's best square is g4, and this kind of gets crazy. eyeing down the G7 pawn, and we just developed the knight to E7. We tempt that queen to come take it. And if it takes it, no bueno. There is the move of rook to G8, but then the queen will grab, H7. So I'm going to recommend knight to G6, and that traps the queen with only one escape. It has to get out this turn by going to H6. Anything else, if it did like move a pawn, then bishop to F8 is going to be bye-bye. They also have, technically, bishop to B5, which pins the knight. So even if we had tried, coming down and hitting the queen, it can get out on the F6 square since the knight is pinned. We're going to back it up like a Tonka truck. And here, instead of the knight coming out, we're going to do what you did. You brought the queen to A5 with check. And white played bishop to D2, aiming right back at you. I consider this queen move a mistake. You shouldn't have developed it. You should have worked on knights and bishops. You're losing a tempo since you have to move the queen, and white got to develop a free piece. So you're basically falling farther behind the development. I understand that you did trade off and capture the C5 pawn eventually, and at move 7, you finally developed the dark squared bishop. Now let's see what position we can get out of if we developed minor pieces instead of messing around with the queen, which is against opening principles. Maybe this will kind of show you why it's against opening principles and you'll look at the game differently. Let's develop the bishop and plug up that light square diagonal that we opened up when we took on C5. It does say 1.42 on white's favor, but I guarantee you it is even or 0.1 at the most for white. I will bring up Stockfish 14.1 and I will crop in the analysis chart at the bottom. White's best move is going to be knight to F3, and then we can bring our knight up as well to C6. That hits the queen. Queen's got to dip back to C3. Now, the move order was important there. We went bishop, then knight. If we would have went knight, then bishop, white could have brought their light squared bishop and pinned our knight, and a couple things could have happened. Best move, knight to E7. Could have kind of got away with unpinning it with the bishop, but the best in my favorite line is queen to A5 check. If the knight has to come block it, because otherwise the bishop would be hanging. And then from here, we can actually just take the bishop. And then the knight would capture our queen. Our knight would capture their queen. Knight would capture knight. And then we would pick up the C5 pawn. Ain't that something? Bringing you back real fast, there's an awesome tactic right here, and I want to see if you can come up with it. Give you 3 seconds to pause the video, and we'll go from there. So there's an awesome tactic, all because the minor pieces are out, and the queen didn't waste tempo and give white the advantage on development. 1, 2, and 3. The awesome move is B6. B-fucking-6. Looks like an absolute no-brainer. If white captures the pawn, we can either get it with the queen or the other pawn, and either way, we're going to have an isolated pawn on the B or A file. Wrong, because if they did fall for that, bishop to B4, pinning the queen. And the only reason why that's possible is because we develop the knight to C6, and the bishop protects the knight because it's on D7. That is the importance of minor piece development. If they don't fall for the trap, basically they're probably just going to push B4, exchange off, and do that. I mean, we're kind of wandering here. The whole point of this is look at what happened because we followed the gaming principles of do not bring out your queen early because you just lose tempo. You could build other stuff. It hinders your gameplay. Do not bring out your queen before move 7 ever again, unless you have a reason to. The show must go on, so let's see what else happened. All right, they brought their bishop out to D3. You brought your knight out. Solid. They brought their bishop out. Okay. Right here, I see a tactic already. Here's a little trick of the trade. Anytime someone moves their bishop before their knight, the second pawn to the end becomes weak, and you got to see if you can hit it with a bishop. Because if you could take out that pawn, you win the rook. And here, just that threat alone, we can take advantage of. We can use the bishop and put it on D4 and we're striking out, and they have to take care of that. They have to prevent us from taking that pawn and losing the rook. So they're either going to push c3 or knight to c3. And after that, we're good to pick up the pawn for free on e5. Going to do it with the knight because we want to keep the bishop pair. I mean, it is solid. They would have to give up their bishop to take it, but we want to kind of hold that. So we're going to take it with the knight. And if they capture it, obviously we recapture and we're good. But their best move from here, honestly, is bringing the knight to b5, looking to fork on c7, the king and the rook. But we have an intermezzo move that we can do. We can win the bishop pair. We snag their bishop with our knight. They have to recapture with the pawn, so now they have an isolated pawn. And then we can slide our bishop back to b6 to cover that c7 square at least once. Now they have the bishop and the knight hitting that square, but the bishop will at least prevent the rook from falling. White also had a different move besides moving up the knight to b5. If they took the bishop and came in with a check, we can block on either of these two squares, either d7 or c6. I'd probably go with c6, and if they don't take, let's say they make a developing move, like the best move, f3 with the knight, we can go ahead and take off and sacrifice our bishop pair, get rid of our strong bishop for doubling their pawns. So they got 2 rows of isolated pawns, A file isolated, C file isolated, double. It's worth it to get rid of that bishop pair. And weighing out the odds, it is slightly stronger. Besides the bishop to d4, there's another good tactic that I got to talk about. This right here, it's roughly about the time in the game. You're going to start looking for the f6 pawn push. You do the c5 early on. I usually get it out by move 7. You do it move 3. And the f pawn break helps develop the knight if you haven't been able to because a pawn is on e5. So here, it's actually great to push f6. If they do accept it, you just recapture with your knight and you're golden. That helped you develop significantly. If they don't recapture and make a strong move like developing the knight, and if you notice, knight to f3 is almost always the best move for all these little stop pause moments where we're having like an intermission and a small discussion, because that's just a developing move. White needs to castle. You are trying to castle. The last thing you want to do, if you don't have to, is develop your king knight on e7. You really want to get it out on f6. So after that knight jumps, we have a tactic here. We don't have to capture that pawn. We can actually push g5, hitting the bishop. Best move is backing up to g3, and then we can push the pawn again, hitting the knight. And now the knight has to back up to d2. And that was defending the pawn in the middle, e5. So now only their dark squared bishop is guarding that pawn, where we have 2 attackers, the knight and the pawn. So we're good to go ahead and scoop it up. I will mention that just from experience, it's okay to not castle in this situation. The queens are off the board, white is underdeveloped, the rooks aren't connected, and you have a massive center. Your center is way bigger than them, so it's a-okay to not castle in this situation. Back to the gameplay. You brought your knight to e7. It's probably best to do the pawn push over e7, and there's another tactic I'm smelling. After they bring their knight to f3, instead of castling, you could probably get away with pushing the f6 here, even with your knight on e7. Because if they take and you take, you're set up for a trap in the middle. If they did something like castle, well, you can push that, kick the bishop. Once the bishop is kicked, regardless of where they go, let's say the best move is probably all the way back, right? No, just one. Trade off, then you got the fork. So pawns marching up the middle are dangerous, like Akon said. So after you castle, they castle, and you push a6. Not bad. I'm assuming you're going to be pushing a b5, trying to grab space. You definitely have the right idea, grabbing queenside space, especially knowing your opponent hasn't. I would say the better move is still, bringing the knight out or the pawn break on that file. But you did something a little wrong because you just didn't have quite the foresight. When you pushed A6, looking to push B5, the knight comes to D2 and you do push B5, great. Those two pawns are on the light squares. You got to figure there's always two ways to do something. I know it just feels natural to have, the inside pawn against the wall, back low, and have everything pointed towards the middle. But if you would have did it the other way and developed the B pawn to B6 and then the other pawn to A5, you could have got your light squared bishop out. And let's look at the analysis real quick. With the way you did it, it looks like it's about +4 for the opponent. If you would have did it the other way, you're looking at -2. And this way you can get your light squared bishop out too and not just be staring at pawns for, the next third of the game like it did the first third. Let's go ahead and put these pawns back the way that they should be, the way that they were played. And the knight jumps to B3, hitting your bishop. Good deal. You didn't blunder it. Perfect square to go to. And they push the A3 pawn, preventing your knight from jumping up, or a B pawn push right now. And you finally move the bishop after 14 moves. Bro, please, for a week straight, try the F5 bishop move opening and drop the C5. Please, 1 week straight. I put a lot of time into this. I would love to see you, prevail. And also, now that bishop has another problem of still not being able to access the board because your D5 pawn is blocking it still. Good point is, they don't have a D pawn, so it should be able to move forward eventually, unless if they form an outpost or something on there. You're just going to have to be patient. They bring their rook to E1. It's probably the best square, one of two openings that they have to access the middle of the board. And you bring your rook to C8. Once again, great idea. It's the only semi-open file you have. Brilliant, and you're moving your rooks now that, you have no pieces to develop. They're in the best squares that they can be at, except for, the rook jump to G6, but you're doing it with the wrong rook. This rook would be better off because this rook is doing nothing important. It's only protecting the F7 pawn, which is perfectly fine under no danger. The pawn over on A6 could potentially be in some shit, or if they end up taking out the B pawn and the A pawn takes it, that'll be on an open file as well. Other good positions for that rook could have been D8, pushing the D pawn in the future, or even B8. So once you do that, the knight comes to G5, looking like an attack on your H pawn. You push up the pawn, hitting it back. That's really good. You could also do the knight. That would block the bishop, and that hits their other bishop. The good thing about the knight rather than the pawn would be the pawn's a permanent move, and that creates a slight weakness on the G6 square, where the knight can just move out of the way, and your castle to king is all GQ once the knight gets out of the way. So the knight jumps back to F3, and then you come forward with the knight on A5. I'm going to mention something about this as well. We're going to go ahead and jump it back. That knight on C6 is one of your more active pieces. Not your most active piece. I would say that's your dark square bishop, but that's doing a great job where it is. And you still have other pieces that you could slightly improve rather than moving that knight to the rim where, yeah, we'd be putting some pressure on their knight and could potentially jump to the C4 square. And if there's a trade-off, you can get your pawn there. I get what your idea was, but the knight jumping to F5 would be a better option because this isn't as active. It's not doing too much on the E7 square, and when you jump it up, it's doing more, and you could maybe entice them to get rid of their light squared bishop, and that's their strongest bishop right now. All your pawns are on the light squares, so it would be awesome if they traded it off. You could have potentially also brought your other rook over to the D8 square since you chose to move your, the other rook first. Or maybe even put your rook up to C7, looking to double the pawns on the C file. All those are better improvements than moving one of your most active pieces. But there's nothing technically wrong with that. There's just better choices. That's all I'm saying. White goes ahead and takes your knight, and you recapture, and you're hitting the rook. That's cool. They move over the rook, and you move over your rook. That's good. And they kick the pawn. I mentioned you didn't have to move over the rook. I mean, There was other moves too. I think, bishop down here is good. Knight over here is good. But what you did is perfectly fine. When they push the B pawn, you move the bishop to the open diagonal. That's good. And they move their rook back to where it was. They really want to protect that E pawn. Oh, beautiful. Yeah, bro, I like that move. Bro, right there, that's what's up. The only other move I say would be contesting that would be pushing the G pawn. Because after the bishop dips out, I mean, you could push it and displace two pieces at once. But maybe after D, you play G, or maybe after G, you play D. But D is a great move. Fantastic move. And now white puts their rook on C1. And you take the knight. I don't know about this. I mean, you're giving up your bishop pair, right? And so now you got bishop knight versus two bishops. I mean, I don't know. I mean, you do double their pawns, but at the same time, you're probably better off using an outpost. If you know what an outpost is, it's when you occupy a square that's protected by a pawn that can't get kicked out by a pawn. So you have outposts on like A4 and C4. If you can get your knight to one of those squares, you're golden. It's almost an outpost, knight to D5, but it could get kicked by the C pawn. But this is a beautiful square right here. I probably would have moved this instead of taking out the knight. I understand you're doubling pawns, so I'm not going to tell you that's a wrong move, but this one's a little better, I think. So you take the knight and they double, and now you bring the knight to G6. I don't know if I like this move. You got a much better square you can jump to right here on D5. You got more better squares you can go. You're still hitting the same bishop, but you can jump to C3 from here. Or you can move the bishop and use the B6 square to rotate around. B6 and then either C4 or A4 and go around that way. But regardless of what the knight does, you just had blindness to this G pawn push. It's been the best move for like the majority of the past, 10, 15 moves. And blindness. Nothing more to say about that. After knight to G6, we have bishop pulling back to D2 and rook to D5. That's ugly. I mean, honestly, it's not like you have too many other good moves here, but that's just ugly, I don't know if I would have tried doubling up, or I probably would have tried moving the knight. Probably bounced on the rim and tried to get that active. Try to hit the F pawn. If that fails, swoop it back around to F5. Move the bishop, try to hit the E pawn. It's, it's just tactics at this point in time, but, I mean, it's not a bad move right here, but it's just ugly, You got no mobility left and right. You got your pawn in the way for anything else. If you're going to double, you're going to want to do it on the C file. And you can't even put that rook on the C file. You're going to have to back it up before you push it over. Anyway, he pushes up the F pawn, and you route the knight. Good job. They bring up the bishop, and you route it to F5. Not too bad. I'm not going to say anything about that. And they move the king to the corner. What is that? You bring your rook back. He brings his rook over. Okay, he's going to double up on the G. You're going to double up on the C. He moves his bishop over. You jump your knight to the rim to hit F3. He stops you. All of these are all good moves, except for that. That's ugly. He just gave away his good bishop for a knight. And now it's rook, good bishop versus rook, bad bishop. So you recapture, and now you got a group of 4 pawns. That's good against his isolated flank pawn on H, and then his double backward pawn on F. You take another pawn, hitting the bishop. These are all beautiful moves. Nothing to say here, except for that right there. No bueno. That should have been in the bag right here. The computer puts you at 3.6 ahead. I don't trust that. I'm gonna run it on Licha, so the Stockfish 14.1. I bet you're upwards of 5. I bet you're like 5 plus, like 5.5. Guarantee you. And this position looks nasty. So I'll be back in about 10 minutes. I'm going to run it through Stockfish 14.1, and we can check it out. Hot damn, boy. 8.8. He was killing it. Don't take this the wrong way, because I do stupid shit too. I've done worse. But I can't believe you botched this one. Should have been a walk in a park. Well, let's get back to the game. Yeah, this you should have kept it pressure on the pawn and brought your king in. In the end game, anytime you freeze up, you got to think what your king can do, and your king could have came in combination with everything and really done some damage. He moved his king up, and you moved your rook over to protect your pawn. But I mean, at the same time, think of it: if his king comes in close and his bishop, backs up and then moves over to hit your pawn, he's got three attackers. You only got two defenders. Even if you brought over your king, there'd be forces of exchanges, and then you just have your king left and his king left. And you have to look at the board on what it looks like without the kings. His passed pawn on e5 is the only thing you have to worry about. That's it. But you have a majority on the king side, so that should be an easy cakewalk since everything on the queen side is locked up. I see that, he messed up and you brought your king in, then you backed up and you pushed g5. And this is not good because think of it, if he captured, he gets one pawn. When you capture back, he's got his bishop on that diagonal. So you lost two pawns for the one and tempo because it's hitting your rook now. What the endgame should have looked like, instead of marching your king away from the action, it should have been marched here. He probably would have came here. I mean, front or back way, it don't matter. And then when you got here, his rook would probably try coming over, hitting your G pawn, and push it up to safety. He would either try to hit your H pawn or coming over to the B file, and you just keep marching up, and eventually he's going to run out of room. And when he backs out, the best square for him is probably fucking over here. You come over here and you try to hit the A pawn, put pressure on that, and making his rook stay on the third rank. And for some reason, if he just doesn't let go, you could always march up the A pawn. If he takes you, you take him, and now you got a second attacker on his bishop. If he doesn't take you and just Tweedledees with his rook, you can go ahead and take him. And if things totally get locked up, you could work on swinging your bishop through the back door. If he's just going to sit there and bob back and forth, bring your bishop out this way. And it should be a clean sweep from there. But it's a tragedy. He played very well. And I guess I'll give you the Springer's final thought once I see how this thing exactly ended. We got here, he took, you took. Yeah, you didn't even see the bishop capture. You took, he took, and now he's got another pass pawn on the end. And he just got you good, didn't he? That was over. Wow. He played a good game though. He had a relatively strong opponent. Like that checkmate, what was that checkmate at 3 at the end? Right here, as soon as you moved your rook over, for him to recognize that, I mean, come on. Here's my final thought, my guy. Here's my final thought. Work on your endgame. Do some tutorials with pawn play. If you don't know anything about like opposition, that'd be good to learn. I'll put a couple links in the description for some other videos. I think that would help you out a little bit. Other than that, I mean, I'm not knocking you. You played really good for being, the rating that you are. You definitely have some skill in the opening. I just think you should change it up. Your middle game is all right. It's pretty solid. Just a couple little principles you got to tweak, like the two pawns on A and B. So, in case your bishop did get trapped back, just another way to do things so your other pieces have more mobility. And as far as the end game goes, the only thing I really have to say is just know when to bring your king into the action. Don't be scared to bring your king in towards, the little combat or the little situation that happened that's froze up at the time. You got to figure your king is worth about 4.5 to 5 points as far as the strength of the piece towards the end game. Like a rook is worth 5. So your king is almost as strong and as valuable as a rook if it did have a point value. Don't underestimate your king as an attacking piece. But this is where we part. Thank you very much for giving me the game. It was an honor for me to do this. I enjoyed it a lot. Do me one favor. Just get back to me. A, let me know what you thought of it overall. And B, let me know what it did to help you with your game. And maybe we can do another one of these in the future when you improve a little bit. Until next time, Thanks a lot, my man. Peace.